Just before dawn on December 7, 1941, the waters of Pearl Harbor were calm. The great battleships of the United States Pacific Fleet rested quietly along the docks of Battleship Row. Sailors were waking up slowly on a Sunday morning. Some were finishing breakfast. Others were preparing for routine duties. For most of them, it seemed like just another peaceful day in Hawaii. No one expected that within minutes, the harbor would become one of the most devastating battlefields in American history. At 7:48 a.m., the silence was broken by the roar of aircraft engines. Dozens of planes suddenly appeared over the mountains of Oahu, flying low and fast toward the harbor. At first, many sailors believed they were American aircraft participating in an exercise, but the illusion shattered almost instantly. Red rising sun insignias were clearly visible on the wings. These were not friendly planes. They were aircraft from the Imperial Japanese Navy. The attack had begun. Torpedo bombers descended toward the harbor, skimming just above the water. Within seconds, the first torpedoes slammed into the sides of the massive battleships anchored below. Explosions erupted across Battleship Row. Water shot into the air as steel hulls were torn open beneath the surface. The harbor that had seemed so calm only moments earlier was now a scene of fire, smoke, and chaos. Sailors rushed to battle stations, many of them half-dressed and confused about what was happening. Sirens began to wail across the base. Anti-aircraft guns started firing wildly into the sky. But the attack was perfectly timed. The fleet had been caught completely off guard. One of the first ships to suffer catastrophic damage was the battleship USS Oklahoma. Multiple torpedoes struck her port side in rapid succession. The huge vessel began to tilt dangerously. Within minutes, she rolled completely over, trapping hundreds of sailors inside the hull. Some managed to escape through hatches before the ship capsized. Others were not so fortunate. Nearby, the USS West Virginia was struck again and again by torpedoes. Explosions ripped through her hull, opening massive wounds below the waterline. The battleship began to sink rapidly into the muddy bottom of the harbor. Crew members struggled to return fire, while oil and seawater flooded the lower decks. Then came the most devastating moment of the entire attack. At 8:06 a.m., a Japanese armor-piercing bomb plunged through the deck of the battleship USS Arizona. It penetrated deep into the ship before detonating inside her forward ammunition magazine. The explosion that followed was catastrophic. A massive fireball shot hundreds of feet into the air. The blast shattered the ship almost instantly. Flames and burning debris rained down across the harbor. More than 1,000 sailors aboard the Arizona were killed in a matter of seconds. Black smoke billowed high above Pearl Harbor, visible for miles. Oil from ruptured fuel tanks spread across the water and ignited, turning parts of the harbor into a sea of fire. Sailors jumped overboard to escape the flames, only to find themselves swimming through burning oil. Japanese dive bombers screamed down from the sky, dropping bombs on airfields and ships alike. Machine gun fire raked the decks of vessels and the runways nearby. Hangars exploded. Aircraft were destroyed before they could even take off. For the attackers, the mission was unfolding almost exactly as planned. Inside the cockpits of the Japanese planes, pilots radioed reports back to their commanders. Through the smoke, they could see battleships burning and sinking beneath them. The harbor was filled with crippled vessels. Some ships were already lying on the bottom in shallow water. Others were engulfed in flames. To the pilots circling overhead, it appeared that the heart of the American Pacific Fleet had been completely destroyed. From their perspective, the mission had achieved a decisive victory. But down in the harbor, the fight was far from over. American sailors and officers struggled desperately to respond. Damage control teams raced through smoke-filled compartments, trying to seal ruptured bulkheads and stop flooding. Firefighters battled towering infernos that threatened to ignite ammunition stores. Medical crews turned docks and warehouses into makeshift hospitals as wounded men were carried ashore. Despite the chaos, acts of extraordinary courage began to unfold everywhere. On several ships, gun crews managed to bring anti-aircraft batteries into action. Sailors who had never fired the weapons before grabbed ammunition and began shooting at the attacking planes. Others used rifles and machine guns, firing into the sky as Japanese aircraft roared overhead. Divers jumped into the oil-covered water to rescue trapped sailors. Some men used cutting torches to try to reach crewmates sealed inside overturned hulls. From inside the capsized Oklahoma, faint hammering could sometimes be heard as trapped sailors banged desperately against the steel, hoping someone outside would hear them. For nearly 2 hours, the assault continued. By the time the final Japanese aircraft turned away and disappeared toward the horizon, Pearl Harbor had been transformed into a graveyard of warships. Battleship Row was devastated. Several of the most powerful ships in the Pacific Fleet were sunk or severely damaged. Thick smoke still hung over the harbor, and fires continued to burn. Across the base, stunned survivors struggled to comprehend what had just happened. Many believed the Pacific Fleet had been crippled beyond repair. Even Japanese commanders were convinced the battleships lying in the harbor would never fight again. From the air, the destruction had looked complete. Steel giants had been shattered, rolled over, or sunk beneath the water. But appearances can be deceiving. Beneath the smoke and oil, most of those ships were still there, resting in the shallow waters of Pearl Harbor. Their hulls were torn open, their compartments flooded, their decks blackened by fire. Yet they had not vanished into the deep ocean. And that single fact would soon change everything. While the world saw only devastation, a small group of American naval engineers and divers were already studying the wreckage. They were asking a question that few others dared to consider. What if the fleet was not dead at all? What if the shattered battleships lying beneath the harbor could somehow be brought back to life? The smoke over Pearl Harbor had barely begun to clear when a new and unexpected battle began beneath the surface of the harbor. The Japanese pilots who had flown away that morning believed they had left behind a permanent graveyard of American warships. From the air, the destruction had looked absolute. Battleships lay burning or capsized. Others had sunk into the muddy floor of the harbor. Oil slicks covered the water, and twisted metal protruded from the surface like the bones of drowned giants. To many observers, the Pacific Fleet seemed finished. But the officers and engineers who arrived to inspect the wreckage saw something different. They noticed something that the attacking pilots had not been able to see from thousands of feet above. Most of the battleships had sunk in relatively shallow water. Instead of disappearing into the deep ocean, they had simply settled on the bottom of the harbor. Their superstructures still rose above the surface. Their hulls were damaged, flooded, and burned, but they were still there. That realization changed everything. Within hours of the attack, the United States Navy began organizing what would become one of the most ambitious salvage operations in maritime history. The man placed in charge of this seemingly impossible mission was Captain Homer N. Wallen, a naval engineer with years of experience in ship repair and naval construction. When he first surveyed the harbor, the scene looked overwhelming. Battleship Row had become a maze of wreckage. The USS West Virginia sat low in the water, riddled with torpedo holes. The USS California had slowly flooded and settled onto the harbor floor. The USS Nevada had attempted to escape the harbor during the attack, but had been forced to beach herself to avoid sinking in the channel. Nearby, the capsized hull of the USS Oklahoma lay upside down, its massive propellers sticking out of the water. And at the center of it all rested the shattered remains of the USS Arizona, still burning days after the explosion that destroyed her. For most people, the destruction looked final, but Wallen approached the problem differently. Instead of asking whether the ships were destroyed, he asked a different question. How badly were they damaged, and what would it take to bring them back? Teams of divers were quickly assembled to begin investigating the wrecks. Their task was dangerous and unlike anything they had ever attempted before. Many of the ships were still filled with oil, fuel, and debris. Fires continued to smolder. The water was thick with floating wreckage, and visibility underwater was often almost zero. The divers descended into this dark, polluted water to begin examining the ships inch by inch. What they discovered was both terrifying and encouraging. The battleships had suffered massive damage. Torpedoes had torn open enormous holes on their sides. Bombs had shattered decks and internal compartments. Entire sections of hull plating were twisted or missing. Inside the ships, rooms were flooded, electrical systems destroyed, and machinery buried beneath debris. Yet the basic structures of many vessels remained intact. If those holes could somehow be sealed, and if the water flooding the ships could be pumped out, there was a chance that some of the battleships might float again. The idea sounded almost unbelievable. Raising ships that weighed tens of thousands of tons seemed impossible. But the engineers studying the problem knew that ships floated for a simple reason. If the hull was sealed and the water removed, buoyancy would do the rest. The challenge was figuring out how to seal enormous holes that were now underwater. Divers began taking careful measurements of the damage. Working by touch in near darkness, they traced the edges of torn steel plates and shattered rivets. Sometimes they had to squeeze through narrow openings or swim through flooded compartments filled with floating debris. Each dive revealed new details about the scale of the task ahead. On the USS West Virginia alone, divers found multiple torpedo holes along the port side of the hull. Some of these openings were so large that a truck could have driven through them. Sealing them would require enormous patches built from heavy steel plates. But attaching those patches underwater was another problem entirely. Engineers began designing custom-built repair plates shaped to match the damaged sections of the hull. These patches would be lowered into the harbor by cranes and positioned by divers. Once in place, they would be bolted or welded against the hull, forming a temporary seal strong enough to hold back the ocean. Even if the patches worked, the ships would still be filled with millions of gallons of seawater. That meant another enormous challenge, pumping them dry. Massive pumps were gathered from shipyards across the Pacific. Long pipes and hoses were prepared to remove water from the flooded compartments. The idea was simple in theory: pump the water out faster than it could leak back in. But first, the ships had to be made watertight. Meanwhile, salvage crews faced another constant danger. Many of the damaged vessels still contained unexploded ammunition. Bombs and shells lay scattered throughout the wrecks. Fires occasionally flared up again as trapped fuel ignited. Every dive carried the risk of explosion or structural collapse, and yet the divers continued their work day after day. Slowly, the outlines of an extraordinary plan began to take shape. The United States Navy would not abandon the battleships lying in Pearl Harbor. Instead, they would attempt to raise them, repair them, and return them to service. It was a bold idea that many considered unrealistic, but Captain Wallen believed it could be done. The operation would require hundreds of engineers, thousands of workers, and months of relentless effort. New tools would have to be invented. Massive steel patches would need to be built,
Divers would have to perform some of the most dangerous underwater work ever attempted. If everything worked perfectly, the ships might float again. If it failed, the wrecks would remain exactly where they were, silent reminders of the worst naval disaster in American history. Standing on the docks overlooking the damaged fleet, Wallen understood the stakes. The United States had just entered a global war, and its Pacific Fleet had been crippled in a single morning. Replacing those battleships from scratch would take years, but raising them from the bottom of the harbor might take months. The decision was made. Instead of building a new fleet, the Navy would attempt to resurrect the one that had just been destroyed.
By early 1942, the salvage operation inside Pearl Harbor had transformed into a massive industrial battlefield beneath the water. What had begun as a desperate inspection of damaged ships was now an enormous engineering effort involving thousands of sailors, divers, welders, and naval architects. Every day, the harbor echoed with the sound of cutting torches, heavy cranes, and powerful pumps working around the clock. But the most dangerous work was happening out of sight, deep below the surface. Salvage divers were sent into the wrecks of the damaged battleships to begin the most difficult phase of the operation, sealing the wounds that had allowed the ocean to flood inside. These men descended into dark, oil-filled water where visibility was sometimes less than a few inches. Thick black fuel oil coated everything. Debris drifted through narrow corridors inside the ships. Sharp metal edges, broken pipes, and loose cables created deadly obstacles in every direction. Many compartments were completely flooded. Others were partially filled with water and air pockets, making the ships unstable and unpredictable. Divers often had to feel their way forward with their hands, unable to see anything through the murky water. In some places, they encountered something even more disturbing. The wrecks still contained the remains of sailors who had not been able to escape during the attack. Divers were forced to continue their work quietly and respectfully in spaces that had become underwater tombs. The emotional toll was heavy, but the mission could not stop. One of the most complex challenges was the battleship USS West Virginia. During the attack, she had been struck by numerous torpedoes that tore enormous holes along her port side. These openings were far too large for simple repairs. If the ship was ever going to float again, engineers would have to create massive steel patches capable of sealing the damage from the outside. Designing those patches was only the beginning. Each patch had to be carefully shaped to match the twisted contours of the damaged hull. Some weighed many tons. Once completed, they were lowered slowly into the harbor by giant floating cranes. Divers waited below to guide the massive plates into position against the ship's side. Working underwater, often by touch alone, the divers aligned the patches with the torn steel surrounding the holes. Bolts were inserted through pre-drilled openings, and large rubber gaskets were compressed between the patch and the hull to create a watertight seal. Every connection had to be perfect. Even a small gap could allow thousands of gallons of seawater to rush back into the ship. The work required patience and extraordinary precision. On the West Virginia, one of the largest repairs required an enormous concrete structure to be built directly against the damaged section of the hull. This massive plug weighed nearly 200 tons and was designed to block one of the most severe torpedo openings. Constructing and positioning it underwater was a challenge that few engineers had ever attempted before. Day after day, the salvage crews continued sealing the wounds of the battleships. Meanwhile, inside the ships, other teams worked to prepare them for refloating. Electric cables were replaced. Temporary lighting systems were installed. Debris and twisted metal were cleared from passageways. Bulkheads were reinforced so the ships could survive the enormous pressure changes that would occur when water was pumped out. And then came the next stage of the operation, removing the water. The ships contained millions of gallons of seawater that had flooded through torpedo holes, shattered pipes, and broken ventilation systems.
To bring the vessels back to the surface, all of that water would have to be removed gradually and carefully. Powerful pumps were brought in from shipyards across the Pacific. Thick hoses snaked across the decks and disappeared into the flooded compartments below. When the pumping finally began, water surged out of the ships and poured back into the harbor. But the process had to be slow. If the water was removed too quickly, the pressure difference could collapse weakened bulkheads or cause the ships to shift dangerously on the harbor floor. Engineers monitored every step, measuring the stability of the hulls as the water levels slowly dropped. As the pumping continued, something remarkable began to happen. Little by little, the massive battleships started to move. At first, the changes were almost invisible. A deck that had been inches above the waterline rose slightly higher. A gun turret that had been half submerged slowly emerged from the harbor. Sailors watching from the docks realized they were witnessing something that had once seemed impossible. The ships were beginning to float again. But the process was far from safe. Trapped pockets of oil and gas sometimes ignited unexpectedly. Fires broke out inside compartments that had not seen air since the attack. Salvage crews rushed in with hoses and extinguishers to prevent new disasters. In other areas, unexploded ammunition was discovered buried beneath debris. Every success was balanced by constant danger. Despite these risks, the crews continued pushing forward. Weeks turned into months as the salvage teams fought gravity, pressure, and time itself. Slowly, the damaged battleships rose higher in the water as more compartments were drained and sealed. For the men working on the operation, each small victory carried enormous meaning. The ships that had been written off as total losses were refusing to stay dead. Above the harbor, visitors and naval officers watched as steel giants that had once seemed permanently destroyed began to reappear piece by piece. Gun turrets, towers, and superstructures emerged from the water like ghosts returning from the depths. The transformation was astonishing. Only a few months earlier, the Japanese attack had appeared to erase the core of the American Pacific Fleet in a single devastating morning. Now, beneath the oil-stained waters of Pearl Harbor, divers and engineers were quietly proving that destruction was not the final chapter of the story. The battleships were rising, and soon the world would see that the fleet Japan believed it had destroyed was slowly coming back to life.
Months after the attack, the harbor at Pearl Harbor no longer looked like a graveyard. It had become one of the busiest and most intense shipyards in the world. Everywhere along the docks, cranes swung heavy steel plates through the air, welding torches flashed like lightning, and the constant rumble of machinery echoed across the water. What had once been the scene of destruction was now a place of relentless rebuilding. The salvage teams had succeeded in the first stage of their mission. Several of the damaged battleships had been sealed, pumped dry, and refloated. But bringing the ships back to the surface was only the beginning. They were still badly damaged, and many of them were barely seaworthy. The next challenge was to transform these wounded giants into combat-ready warships again. As the water was finally pumped out of the compartments of the USS West Virginia, crews entered spaces that had been underwater since the morning of the attack. The interior of the ship looked like the aftermath of a violent storm. Mud from the harbor floor coated the decks. Oil clung to every surface. Broken equipment, twisted pipes, and shattered machinery filled entire rooms. Teams of workers moved through the ship methodically, clearing debris and repairing critical systems. Electrical wiring had to be replaced. Boilers and turbines were dismantled and rebuilt. Weapon systems that had been destroyed by explosions or corrosion were removed and prepared for replacement. The work never stopped. Day and night, welders cut away damaged steel, while engineers designed stronger reinforcements to replace it. Many of the battleships would not simply be repaired, they would be modernized. Lessons from the attack had already revealed weaknesses in the fleet's defenses. When these ships returned to service, they would be far more powerful than before. Anti-aircraft weapons were dramatically increased. Radar systems were installed to detect enemy aircraft long before they could reach the fleet. Fire control equipment was upgraded to improve accuracy during combat. Even the ship's internal layouts were redesigned to strengthen damage control capabilities. The transformation was remarkable. Ships that had been sinking wrecks only months earlier were slowly becoming modern war machines. Some of the damaged vessels were stable enough to be repaired directly in the shipyards at Pearl Harbor. Others required a long journey across the Pacific to the massive naval shipyards on the American mainland. Temporary repairs allowed them to travel under their own power, escorted by other vessels for full reconstruction. Watching these ships leave the harbor was a powerful moment for the sailors who had fought to save them. The USS Nevada, which had attempted to escape the harbor during the attack before being forced to beach herself, was one of the first to return to service. After extensive repairs and modernization, she sailed back into the Pacific, ready to fight again. The USS California and USS West Virginia followed similar paths. Their damage had been severe, but the months of relentless work by engineers and shipyard crews had slowly restored them to life. When they finally departed for additional upgrades, they carried with them the proof that the salvage operation had succeeded. Even ships that appeared hopeless were studied carefully to determine what could be recovered. Some provided spare equipment or machinery that helped repair other vessels. Nothing was wasted. Every piece of steel, every weapon, every engine component was evaluated and reused whenever possible. Behind this enormous effort stood the vast industrial power of the United States. Factories across the country were producing steel, engines, weapons, and electronics at an astonishing pace. Railroads carried massive equipment from inland factories to West Coast shipyards. Thousands of workers, many of them civilians who had never before worked in shipbuilding, joined the war effort. Pearl Harbor had become the front line of a different kind of battle, the battle to rebuild faster than the enemy could destroy. What made the salvage operation even more extraordinary was the speed at which it progressed. In most naval disasters, sunken ships remained on the ocean floor forever. The complexity and cost of raising them were simply too great. But in Pearl Harbor, the urgency of war forced the Navy to attempt what had rarely been done before. Engineers pushed the limits of technology and improvisation. When new tools were needed, they were invented. When problems appeared, solutions were created on the spot. Every week seemed to bring new progress. Decks that had once been blackened by fire were repaired and repainted. Gun turrets that had been silent during the attack were restored and tested. Engines that had been flooded with seawater roared back to life after months of careful rebuilding. For the sailors returning to serve on these ships, the experience was deeply emotional. Many of them had witnessed the destruction of the fleet firsthand. Some had lost friends and crewmates during the attack. Walking the decks of these restored battleships felt like stepping into a symbol of survival. The ships themselves seemed to carry the memory of that day. Yet they also represented something else: resilience. By the time the first of the rebuilt battleships began returning to operational fleets, the war in the Pacific had already intensified. New battles were being fought across thousands of miles of ocean. Aircraft carriers were emerging as the dominant force at sea, but battleships still played a crucial role in naval warfare. Their heavy guns were unmatched when it came to bombarding enemy positions along coastlines and islands. Their armor allowed them to survive intense combat, and now, thanks to months of repair and modernization,
The ships rescued from Pearl Harbor were ready to join that fight. The transformation from wreckage to warship had taken enormous effort, but the results were undeniable. What had once looked like a shattered fleet lying helpless in a burning harbor was now becoming a powerful force once again. The ships were sailing out of Pearl Harbor not as broken relics of a surprise attack, but as rebuilt weapons of war. And soon they would return to the Pacific battlefield where their guns would thunder once more.
By the time the final stages of the salvage effort were complete, the harbor at Pearl Harbor had undergone an extraordinary transformation. What had once been a field of burning wreckage was now a fully functioning naval base again, filled with ships preparing for war. The same waters that had held sinking battleships and floating debris now reflected the silhouettes of repaired vessels ready to sail back into combat. The work that had begun in desperation on the morning of December 7th had turned into one of the most remarkable engineering achievements of the entire war. As the rebuilt battleships returned to service, they did not return quietly. Each vessel that left the harbor carried with it the story of survival and recovery. Many of the sailors standing on their decks knew exactly where these ships had once been, half submerged, burning, and written off as total losses. Now they were heading back into the Pacific. The USS Nevada was among the first to rejoin combat operations. After extensive repairs and modernization, she sailed west to support Allied operations across the Pacific theater. Her massive guns were soon firing again, this time against enemy positions instead of helplessly defending against incoming aircraft. Other ships followed in the months and years that came after. The USS West Virginia, once riddled with torpedo holes and resting on the harbor floor, underwent one of the most dramatic transformations of all. After being raised and temporarily repaired at Pearl Harbor, she was sent to major shipyards in the United States, where she was almost completely rebuilt. When she returned to service, she looked like an entirely new battleship. Her superstructure had been redesigned, radar systems had been installed, her anti-aircraft defenses had been greatly expanded. Beneath the steel armor that had once been torn open by torpedoes, new internal protection systems strengthened the ship against future attacks. By the time she sailed back into the Pacific war zone, she was stronger than ever before. As the conflict intensified, these resurrected battleships began to play a powerful role in the final campaigns of the war. Their heavy guns were used to bombard enemy defenses on islands across the Pacific, clearing the way for amphibious landings by Allied forces. When fleets approached heavily fortified coastlines, the thunder of battleship artillery often came first. Shells weighing nearly a ton roared through the air and slammed into enemy bunkers, gun positions, and supply depots. The ships that had once been sinking wrecks in Pearl Harbor were now delivering some of the most powerful naval bombardments of the war. One of the most dramatic moments came during the massive naval confrontation known as the Battle of Leyte Gulf. This battle, one of the largest naval engagements in history, took place in October 1944 as Allied forces moved to liberate the Philippines. During the battle, the USS West Virginia and several other rebuilt battleships faced the Japanese fleet once again. For the first time since the attack on Pearl Harbor, some of the same ships that had been damaged or sunk in that harbor were now confronting Japanese forces in open combat. The symbolism was impossible to ignore. When the guns of the West Virginia fired during the night battle in Surigao Strait, they were firing not just shells, but history itself. The fleet that had once seemed destroyed had returned to the fight. Across the Pacific theater, the rebuilt ships continued supporting operations through the final stages of the war.
Their guns bombarded enemy islands, protected carrier task forces, and helped secure vital sea routes for Allied forces moving across the ocean. Each mission carried a quiet reminder of where these ships had come from. Back in December 1941, the Japanese attack had been designed to cripple American naval power in the Pacific. The goal was simple: destroy the fleet so completely that the United States would struggle for years to rebuild it. But the salvage operation at Pearl Harbor had changed that outcome. Instead of waiting years for new ships to be built, the Navy had brought many of its damaged vessels back to life in a fraction of the time. Engineers, divers, and shipyard workers had turned catastrophe into opportunity. They had taken shattered steel and flooded hulls and transformed them back into weapons capable of fighting a global war. The lesson was profound. War is often measured in battles and victories, but sometimes it is decided by something quieter and less visible: determination, ingenuity, and the ability to rebuild when everything appears lost. At Pearl Harbor, that principle had been proven beneath the harbor itself. When visitors stand along the shoreline today, the water appears peaceful again. The harbor reflects the sky, and ships move slowly through the same channels that once filled with smoke and fire. Beneath those waters, however, lies the memory of what happened there. The twisted steel of the USS Arizona still rests on the harbor floor as a permanent memorial to the sailors who never returned home. Oil still rises slowly from the wreck, forming small droplets on the surface that many visitors called the tears of the ship. Nearby, the ships that were once raised from the bottom went on to serve through the final years of the war before eventually retiring from active duty. But their story did not end with their last mission. The salvage operation at Pearl Harbor became a lasting symbol of resilience and industrial power. It demonstrated that destruction does not always mean defeat. Even in the aftermath of disaster, human ingenuity can rebuild what seemed impossible to restore. At Pearl Harbor, that principle had been proven beneath the harbor itself. The ships that rose from the harbor carried that message across the Pacific. They proved that the fleet Japan believed it had destroyed had not vanished at all. It had simply been waiting beneath the water, ready to rise again.